There are many questions that arise about the current situation at the international level. There are now so many conflicts and open fronts at once that it's not just me. Many of us are wondering if we are already facing a third world war or a Cold War 2.0. Because indeed, right now, there are so many changes happening that haven't been seen in a very long time. So, from my personal point of view, from Donbass in this case, it's with the experience of being a war correspondent inside the war in Ukraine. I'll move on to answer the question, where from? I think we're finding ourselves in these very moments. I aim to be brief yet thorough. Stay until the end and let's discover together exactly what it is that we're experiencing right now. Well, I think this depends. And I want to bring up again here the question that I think is absolutely key from the perspective we want to take when answering. That is, if we are talking about conflicts openly, actively, then no, we are not yet in World War III as such, since we are not seeing this direct confrontation between powers. That is, Russia, the United States, meaning there is no encounter between soldiers of both nations. Well, whether it's Russia and the European Union. I think my point is clear. The situation could be very different, whether it's China and the United States and so on, but there is no such direct confrontation in any country. In Ukraine, it happens, and there are mercenaries from several European Union countries, from the United States, and there are even NATO military officials. There are mercenaries, the European Union as well. Considering the number of changes happening internationally, the Cold War 2.0 is definitely here. And I actually think it never really disappeared completely. It's true that there was a time when the Russian Federation, as the successor of the Soviet Union, lost by a landslide right after the fall of that same Soviet Union. And that's precisely why we're now seeing how Russia has to regain all its power at a rapid pace. And above all its influence. Even the very image of a country with a minimum of power and influence, indeed, at the international level, which it stopped having, not after 1991. The architect, without a doubt, of these changes, very, very favorable for the sovereignty of Russia in particular, and for the rest of the world, for the countries of the rest of the world in general. It's definitely Vladimir Putin. That's exactly why. That's why Russia, at a certain point, wasn't really doing anything on the international level, but rather preparing for whatever might come. What would come since there was no capacity? We have to be absolutely clear about this. So yes, we are in a Cold War. 2-0 the conflict in terms of World War III. However, if we look at it from a somewhat broader perspective, that is, if we introduce the variable of, so it's not so much armies facing each other anymore, but rather powers confronting each other in conflicts on the territory of third countries, as happens, for example, in this particular case, on Ukrainian territory, between NATO and the Russian Federation. That's why from Russia, they talk about a special military operation on the ground in Ukraine, but they also talk about the war that NATO is waging against Russia. In this sense, indeed, the conflict is seen in terms of a third war. Well, in terms of the Third World War, it's absolutely clear and it's already underway. Here, there's something I'd like to emphasize and call for a bit of calm. Considering how long we've been analyzing the Ukrainian conflict, it has had countless opportunities to escalate, but it has been more or less escalating a little, yet in the end, it has kind of stayed in the same place. That is, what would be the decisive step? At no point has it moved toward what could be the ultimate end in the form of a total war. Why does this happen exactly? Well, basically, that's my opinion. Let's see what you all think. Because I believe absolutely no one is interested in losing their own position, unless the threat is already too serious. And then it happens that a wounded wild boar ends up taking down everything in its path. This could happen, for example, with Iran. Now that we're talking about an imminent American aggression against Iran from the United States and Israel against Iran. Of course, because if they end up attacking that country too harshly, especially if they try to remove the Ayatollah's regime from power, particularly Ayatollah Khamenei, that's exactly what could happen. In Iran, this could be seen as the sign of the beginning of an endless war, the start of total war. Iran currently does not appear to have nuclear weapons. So, well, that means World War III wouldn't necessarily break out because of that, but we would get pretty close to it. And not to mention a scenario in which, for example, European soldiers could be stationed in Ukraine on the border with the Russian Federation. They would become a legitimate military target for that country, and in the end, this could trigger whether it's Russia attacking this legitimate target or them attacking Russia themselves or providing cover for Ukraine. While doing so, that could become the perfect excuse to start World War III. But really, from this channel? And look, I also talk about escalations of conflict and rising tensions. But we always try to be quite cautious about this, talking every now and then about the international situation in terms of, is World War III going to break out? There are cases that really make your heart sink and make you say, wow, now we really are much closer than we were before. Here, one wrong move by a madman, and we all end up plummeting downhill with no brakes. I mean, going downhill with no brakes. However, right now, it doesn't seem like global leaders really want to trigger a conflict of such magnitude at any point. Because, and this is just my own observation, and here you can tell me how much you agree or disagree with me. International leaders, after all, want to live, and they want their families to live too. The vast majority of them have huge savings abroad, and I think this is also perfectly clear, savings at the expense of the people. Regardless of whether we're talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa countries, or the countries of the collective West, corruption is something quite universal for them, for their families, and also in some way, because no one, I think, wants to see what makes us human disappear, except for a few fanatics who, thank God, don't have access to the media nowadays, who could actually lead us all to the most definitive abyss. So, on one hand, we're probably at the moment of greatest conflict. But what I think we should highlight here, as I believe we should, let's say, describe it, is that we are in a moment of paradigm shift when the Western hegemonic model has already stopped working. When the multipolar model of the rest of the countries, including, for example, China and Russia, and in fact led by China and Russia, is becoming stronger and stronger. But when there are still many steps to take at the intersection, not just in this transition, so to speak, from one model to the other. And I think that where we are is precisely at this intermediate point. In about 20 years, we'll probably end up exactly in the multipolar model, and then we'll see if time proves us right or not. In terms of the multipolar world, what it meant and what it was also intended for was to reduce the level and intensity of conflicts. And what it meant was that countries respected each other, that they dealt with each other based on their own interests, based on their own national sovereignty. And therefore, this would end up putting the world in a place infinitely more just than where it is today. Whether this will be the case or not, time will tell us very soon.